My father said, "Your motorcycle won't pay off the mortgage." And my brother mocked me until he asked for help. Hey everyone. Before I start my story, I have to ask for a small favor. Our channel has been struggling with views, and only a small percentage of people watch until the end. If you enjoy these stories, please subscribe, like the video, and turn on notifications. It helps us continue bringing you more content. Thank you. Now let's get into it. Hey Reddit. My name is Ivan. I am 32, and I have always been the outsider in my family. Not in a way where I was mistreated or ignored, but in a way where it was obvious that I was never the son my parents wanted. That role was already filled by my younger brother Alexander, who was the golden child, the prodigy, the one they put all their hopes and expectations into. From the moment he was born, it was clear that he was their pride and joy. He was naturally gifted, a straight-A student, excelling in every academic field imaginable, and they gave him every opportunity to succeed. They paid for his private tutors, encouraged him to join every possible competition, and made sure he had the best resources for his future. Every conversation at the dinner table was about his achievements, his progress, and his bright future. Meanwhile, I was just there. I liked motorcycles. I was never a bad student, but I was never exceptional either. I didn't care about science fairs, debate clubs, or chess tournaments. What I loved was working with my hands, fixing things, and understanding how machines worked. When I was a teenager, I spent most of my free time hanging around my neighbor's garage. Everyone called him Uncle Peter, though he wasn't related to anyone. He was an old-school mechanic, always covered in grease, always tinkering with something, and he took me under his wing. He taught me how to take apart an engine, how to rebuild a carburetor, how to diagnose a problem just by listening to the way an engine hummed or stuttered. He never talked down to me, never treated my interest like it was something useless, and that was probably why I enjoyed spending time with him so much. My parents thought it was a waste of time. My father constantly told me that playing with engines wasn't a real skill and that I would eventually grow out of it. My mother used to sigh and say it was just a phase, something I would eventually abandon when I realized how ridiculous it was. They never encouraged it, never showed any interest in what I was learning, and never took it seriously. Meanwhile, when Alexander won a math competition, they celebrated with a fancy dinner and bought him a new laptop to encourage his studies. When I fixed my first motorcycle on my own and made my first real money from repairing a neighbor's bike, they barely acknowledged it. My mother just told me not to spend it all on junk, and my father nodded and went back to reading his newspaper. It was always like that. Every major milestone in Alexander's life was an event. When he got into university, they were ecstatic and threw him a party. When I got accepted into a technical college, my father just grunted and said, "Well, at least you will have a job." When Alexander graduated, they bought him a car. When I finished school and started working at a garage, they barely said anything. Over time, I learned not to expect anything from them. I focused on what I loved, worked hard, and eventually opened my own small repair shop. It wasn't a huge business, but it was mine, and I built it from the ground up. I had steady customers, good income, and a job that actually made me happy. But my parents never saw it that way. To them, I was still the one who did not live up to expectations. They would always introduce Alexander as their brilliant son who worked in finance. But when people asked about me, they would just say, "Oh, he has a small business, nothing serious." The breaking point came a few years ago on my father's birthday. We all gathered at my parents' house, and it was the first time I had seen them in months. Alexander arrived in a brand new Mercedes, which I later found out my parents had helped him buy. He handed my father a fancy watch that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and my parents were thrilled. My father immediately put it on and kept admiring it, going on and on about how generous and successful Alexander had become. I had bought my father a professional-grade toolkit because I knew he had been talking about fixing up things around the house, and I thought he would appreciate it. I handed him the gift, and he barely looked at it before setting it aside. He didn't even open it. He just muttered a quick thank you and went back to talking about Alexander's job, his promotions, and how proud they were of him. That was the moment it truly hit me. It didn't matter what I did or how successful I became in my own way. They would never see me the way they saw him. They never even tried to understand my path, and they never would. I decided then and there to stop trying. I distanced myself from them, stopped answering their calls as often, and stopped making an effort to visit. I wasn't angry. I was just done. Years passed, and my business grew. I bought my own house, finally got my dream motorcycle, and built a life that I was proud of. I was content, even if my parents never acknowledged it. They never called to ask about my work, never asked if I needed anything, and never showed any interest in my life. But then, a few months ago, my mother called me out of nowhere. She didn't call to check on me or to ask how I was doing. She called because Alexander was in trouble. Apparently, my brilliant, successful brother had gotten himself into some serious financial problems. He had taken risks that didn't pay off, made bad investments, and now he was drowning in debt. My parents had already sold some of their property to bail him out, but it wasn't enough, and now they needed my help. My mother said I should do it for family, that Alexander would have done the same for me if I were in his position. I laughed. I actually laughed because I could not believe the audacity. I asked her if she truly believed that Alexander would ever lift a finger to help me if our roles were reversed. She hesitated, and that was all I needed to hear. I told her no. I wasn't going to be their backup plan just because their perfect son had failed them. She tried to guilt-trip me, telling me that family should always help each other, but I reminded her that family had never meant much when it came to me. They had spent their whole lives treating me like an afterthought, and now they expected me to come running when they needed something. I told her I hoped they figured things out, but I would not be part of it. Then I hung up. My father called a few days later and tried a different approach, but I gave him the same answer. I was not their safety net. If they only remembered me when they needed something, then I was better off without them. I haven't spoken to them since, and honestly, I don't regret it. For the first time in my life, I feel like I am living for myself and not for the approval I was never going to get. I started working in an auto repair shop when I was still a teenager, taking whatever shifts they would give me, sweeping floors, fetching tools, and watching the mechanics work with a kind of admiration I never felt for anything else. I saved every dollar I earned, stuffing cash into an old coffee can under my bed because I knew I would need every bit of it to build the life I wanted. While other kids my age were spending their weekends going to parties, buying the newest sneakers, or upgrading their phones, I was in the shop late into the evening, learning everything I could, watching, asking questions, and taking mental notes. I spent my nights reading about business plans, researching how to get a small business loan, and dreaming about the day I would open my own garage. Meanwhile, my younger brother Alexander never had to worry about money, work, or struggle. My parents made sure of that. The moment he finished high school, they paid for his university tuition in full, bought him a brand new laptop, covered his rent in a nice apartment, and made sure he had everything he needed to succeed. He never had to think about how much money he had left at the end of the month, never had to pick up an extra shift to afford a bill, and never had to plan out his meals to make sure his groceries would last until his next paycheck. While I was living paycheck to paycheck, grinding through long hours in the shop and saving every cent, he was going on trips with his friends, eating at expensive restaurants, and enjoying the kind of life that was handed to him without a second thought. My parents never questioned whether they should support him. They believed in his potential, in his bright future, in the career they envisioned for him. But when it came to me, their attitude was completely different. When I mentioned that I wanted to open my own garage one day, they dismissed it as some childish fantasy. My father scoffed and said, "You need real money for that, not just whatever you make fixing bikes." My mother told me to be realistic, to find something stable, to stop dreaming so big. I knew I couldn't count on them for anything, so I lived as simply as possible, cutting back on every unnecessary expense, skipping out on vacations, avoiding shopping for new clothes unless absolutely necessary, and never spending a cent unless it contributed to my long-term goal. I lived like a monk, wearing the same worn-out jeans, driving an old beat-up car, and saying no every time someone invited me out because I couldn't justify spending money on drinks or dinner when I could be putting it toward my future. I watched as my friends moved into better apartments, upgraded their lifestyles, and enjoyed their youth, while I counted every dollar and reminded myself that one day it would all pay off. It was exhausting, not just the work itself but the loneliness that came with it. There were nights when I lay awake, wondering if I was making a mistake, if I should have taken the easier path, if I should have accepted that I wasn't meant to have more. But then I would think about what it would feel like to stand in my own garage, with my name on the sign, with a business that I built with my own hands, and I knew I couldn't give up. My parents never noticed the sacrifices I made. They never once asked if I needed help, never acknowledged how hard I was working, and never showed even the smallest bit of pride in what I was trying to achieve. They saved their admiration for Alexander, for his degrees, his promotions, and his success, as if those things mattered more simply because they fit into their idea of what a respectable life should look like. They saw his comfort and stability as something to celebrate, while they saw my struggle as proof that I had chosen the wrong path. I kept pushing forward, even when it felt impossible, because I knew no one was coming to save me. Everything I had earned on my own, and everything I wanted, I would have to fight for. By the time I turned 18, I had saved $120,000. It had taken me years of relentless work, every shift I could take, every extra hour I could squeeze in, every unnecessary expense cut down to the bare minimum. I had spent countless nights studying business plans, calculating expenses, researching the best suppliers, and preparing every detail for the garage I wanted to open. I had the location in mind. I had suppliers lined up, and I had a plan that was as solid as I could make it. The only thing I needed was a cosigner for a loan to cover the rest of the startup costs, something that would turn my savings into a fully functioning business. I was not asking for money, just for someone to put their name on the paperwork to help me get started. I sat my parents down, prepared to show them everything I had worked on. I had printed out the documents, organized the numbers, and made sure I had answers to any questions they might have. I was proud of how much work I had put into it, how responsible and prepared I was, and how I had done everything the right way. But before I could even begin explaining, my father cut me off, waving a hand dismissively before leaning back in his chair with a smirk. He did not even look at the papers. My mother shook her head before I could finish my first sentence. I tried again, explaining that I had spent years saving, that this was not some impulsive decision, but something I had planned down to the last detail. My father laughed, a deep, mocking laugh that made my stomach drop before he even spoke. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and looked at me like I was a child telling a ridiculous story. "Nobody is going to pay for a dirty mechanic," he said, shaking his head as if the entire idea was beneath him. His words hit harder than I expected, harder than I wanted to admit. I had spent my entire life working for this, proving that I was capable, showing that I had a plan, and he could not even take me seriously. I tried to argue, tried to make him see the numbers, the logic, the potential, but it was useless. They would not even listen. It was as if I had been speaking another language, one they had no interest in understanding. My mother just sighed and told me I needed to be realistic, that I should focus on finding a steady job instead of chasing foolish dreams. My father stood up before I could say another word, brushing past me as if the conversation had never happened, already moving on to something more important. I left the table feeling humiliated, but worse than that, I felt like I had finally reached the end of whatever hope I had left that they would ever take me seriously. Later that week, I walked into the kitchen to grab something to drink, and I stopped when I heard my parents talking in the next room. I had not planned to listen, but then I caught a familiar number. $120,000. My father was explaining to my mother that they had refinanced the house, taken out a loan, and sent the money to Alexander to make sure he had everything he needed for a comfortable student life. My mother was agreeing, saying it was necessary for his future, that it was an investment in something real. I stood there, gripping the glass in my hand so tightly I thought it might break, listening to them talk about how proud they were that they could support him in the way he deserved. I did not say anything. I did not storm into the room or demand an explanation. I just stood there, feeling everything inside me settle into a cold, unwavering certainty. It was never about the money. It was never about what was realistic or what was smart. It was about who they believed in and who they didn't. That night, I packed my things. I did not take much, just what I needed. I left my keys on the kitchen counter and walked out the front door without a word. I did not tell them where I was going, and they did not call to ask. I drove to another city with nothing but my savings, my tools, and a determination that had never burned hotter in my entire life. If they would not believe in me, then I would do it without them. I had spent years thinking that one day they would see me for who I was and what I was capable of, but now I understood that it would never happen. They had made their choice, and now I was making mine. The city I arrived in was known for its strong motorcycle culture, a place where bikers, mechanics, and enthusiasts gathered at every corner, and where garages were filled with people who understood the beauty of machines the same way I did. It was not the kind of place where you could just walk in and expect to be accepted, but I knew that if I was going to make a name for myself, this was where I had to start. I rented a room in a rundown shared house that smelled like mildew, had cockroaches skittering in the corners, and pipes that rattled whenever someone used the water. It was the kind of place where you slept with one eye open, where the locks barely worked, and where every morning felt like a battle just to get out the door without running into something worse than bad plumbing. But it was cheap, and cheap was all I could afford. I found a job at a local garage, one that was run by an older mechanic named Terrace. He was a gruff, no-nonsense kind of guy who barely looked up when I walked in asking for work. He told me he did not need anyone, that he was tired of kids coming in thinking they could handle real work just because they had changed the oil in their mom's car a few times. I told him I was not looking for an easy job, that I was willing to do whatever needed to be done, that I knew what I was doing, and that if he gave me 1 week to prove myself, I would work for free. He looked me up and down, muttered something about how I was probably full of it, and then pointed to the dirtiest, most rusted-out bike in the shop and told me to strip it down and rebuild it. I got to work without another word. Therese barely spoke to me for the first few weeks, only giving instructions when necessary and watching me like a hawk, waiting for me to mess up. But I never did. I worked through every break, stayed late, and never complained, no matter how exhausting it got. Slowly, he started to trust me, giving me bigger jobs, letting me handle more complicated repairs, and even nodding in approval every now and then, which, coming from him, felt like the highest form of praise. I worked 60 to 70 hours a week at the garage, barely making enough to cover my rent and the cheapest food I could find. Instant noodles, canned beans, and the occasional meal from a dollar menu became my entire diet. But even after spending all day fixing bikes at Tara's shop, I was not done. At night, I worked in the tiny garage space I had managed to rent with whatever money I had left. It was nothing more than a small, poorly lit unit in the back of an industrial lot, barely big enough to fit a few bikes at a time, but it was mine. I took on whatever jobs I could get, no matter how small, no matter how unprofitable. At first, it was just basic repairs, fixing flat tires, changing oil, replacing brake pads, things that barely made me any money but got people talking. I knew that if I wanted to build something real, I had to start with trust, so I kept my prices low, worked faster than anyone else, and made sure that every customer left satisfied. Word spread slowly, and little by little, people started coming back. They brought their friends, their brothers, their riding buddies, and suddenly, I was working late into the night, falling asleep on the cold floor of my garage more often than I was making it back to my miserable room. The first 3 months were brutal. There were days when I questioned if I had made the right decision, when my body ached from exhaustion, when I counted my remaining dollars and realized I barely had enough to get through the next week. But every time I started to doubt, I reminded myself why I was here. I was building something that no one could take away from me, something that was mine, something that did not rely on my parents' approval or their permission. I was finally free, and even though it was the hardest thing I had ever done, I knew I would rather struggle on my own than ever go back to being the afterthought in someone else's life. One evening, just as I was closing up my garage for the night, a man pulled up in a truck with a trailer hitched to the back. I could tell right away that whatever was inside, it was something special by the way he carefully unstrapped it and the way he looked at it like it was a part of him. When he finally wheeled it down, I saw the bike in all its neglected beauty, a vintage Harley-Davidson, a rare model that had clearly seen better days. The paint was chipped, the engine looked like it had not roared to life in years, and from the way the owner sighed before speaking, I could tell he had almost given up on it. He told me that he had taken it to 3 different shops, and none of them could fix it. They all told him it would take months, cost more than it was worth, or that some parts were too far gone to be repaired. He had heard about me from a friend and figured he had nothing to lose by giving me a shot. I ran my hands over the body of the bike, feeling every scratch, dent, and rusted bolt, and I already knew I was going to take this job no matter what it required. I told him I would do whatever it took to bring it back to life, and he gave me a skeptical look before saying he had heard that before. I just nodded, wheeled it into my garage, and got to work. For the next 3 days, I barely slept. I stripped the bike down to its bones, inspected every part, cleaned, repaired, and replaced whatever I could, and fabricated pieces that no longer existed. I worked through exhaustion, drinking coffee until my hands shook, ignoring the aches in my back and the burning in my eyes, because something inside me knew this was the kind of job that could change everything. By the 3rd night, my body was on the verge of collapse, but as I tightened the last bolt and wiped my hands clean, I knew I had done it. When I turned the key and heard the engine roar to life with a deep, perfect growl, it was better than any victory I had ever felt before. The next morning, the client arrived, looking like he was already prepared for disappointment. But the moment I started the bike and he heard it purr like it had just rolled off the factory line, his entire expression changed. He ran his hands over the polished metal, his eyes scanning every detail, disbelief turning into pure admiration. He asked how I managed to do what 3 other mechanics could not, and I just shrugged, telling him that when you love something enough, you refuse to let it die. He did not just pay me the agreed amount. He pulled out his wallet and handed me an extra $1,000, saying that work like mine deserved more than what I had asked for. Then, as he threw his leg over the seat and revved the engine, he told me something that changed my business forever. He said he had a lot of friends, the kind of friends who owned expensive bikes, rare bikes, and who were always looking for someone they could actually trust. He told me he was going to recommend me to every single one of them. I thought he was just being polite, but within a week, I had more calls than I could handle. Riders started showing up at my garage, each one telling me they had heard I was the guy to go to when nobody else could fix their bike. The work kept coming. The money finally started growing instead of disappearing as soon as I made it. And for the first time, I could see a real future for myself. I saved every extra dollar, refusing to let myself get comfortable, knowing that if I played this right, I could finally make my dream a reality. Months passed, and I reached the point where I had enough saved to take the biggest risk of my life. I found a location, a space big enough to turn into a proper shop, one that could hold more bikes, more tools, and more possibilities. It was not easy, it was not cheap, but it was mine. The moment I signed the lease, standing in the empty space that would become my own garage, I realized that after years of sacrifice, rejection, and struggle, I had finally made it. Finding a space for my shop was harder than I expected, not because there were no options, but because I had to be smart with every dollar I had. I refused to take out a massive loan and end up buried in debt before I even had the chance to succeed. After weeks of searching, I finally found an old, run-down building that had once been a vape shop. The walls were still covered in faded posters advertising flavored liquids, the floors were scuffed and stained, and the entire place smelled like artificial mint and stale air, but the price was right, and the space had potential. I signed the lease without hesitation, knowing that whatever condition it was in, I could make it work. The first thing I did was strip everything down to its bare bones. I ripped out the old shelves, scrubbed years of grime off the walls, and started repainting with my own 2 hands. I did not hire contractors, I did not pay anyone to help, and I did not waste money on anything I could do myself. Every morning, I woke up on a cheap fold-out cot in the back storage room, made instant coffee on a portable stove, and got to work. I painted the walls a deep, clean gray, installed bright LED lights to make sure every detail of a bike would be visible, and spent hours organizing my tools so that everything was exactly where I needed it to be. I had a vision for what my shop should look like, and even though it was taking shape slowly, I knew I was building something that would last. I named it Iron Horse Garage. It felt right, like something strong and unshakable, something that represented the machines I loved and the work I had dedicated my life to. I designed the logo myself, simple but bold, and had it printed on signs, business cards, and even the shirts I wore every day. Marketing was another battle entirely. I could not afford fancy ads or big promotional campaigns, so I took to social media, posting pictures of every project I worked on, documenting the transformation of the shop, and sharing every success story, no matter how small. I made sure that every customer who walked through my doors left with more than just a fixed bike. They left knowing that I treated their machine like it was my own. Word of mouth had already gotten me this far, and I knew that if I kept delivering quality work, it would continue to spread. For the first 3 months, I barely saw the outside world. I worked 18-hour days, fixing bikes during business hours and handling everything else, accounting, ordering parts, maintaining the shop, late into the night. I ate when I remembered to, usually something quick and cheap that I could shove into my mouth between jobs, and I slept on the same fold-out cot in the back, too exhausted to care that my living space was little more than a storage closet. But despite the exhaustion, despite the long nights and the overwhelming responsibility of running everything on my own, I had never felt more alive. Every time I saw a satisfied customer right away, every time someone recommended my shop to a friend, every time I looked around at the space I had built with my own hands, I knew I had done the right thing. This was mine, and no one could ever take it away from me. Iron Horse Garage started as just another small shop in a city filled with mechanics, but as the months went by, something changed. Word spread fast, especially among the tight-knit community of vintage motorcycle enthusiasts who had spent years searching for someone who actually knew how to bring their machines back to life. These were not the kind of riders who trusted just anyone with their bikes. They had been burned before by garages that did sloppy work, by mechanics who treated their vintage rides like any other repair job, by businesses that did not understand that some bikes carried more than just miles. They carried history. But once they saw the kind of work I did, once they realized that I treated every bike like it was my own, they kept coming back. It started with smaller jobs, restorations, and engine rebuilds for classic Harleys and Indian motorcycles. But the real breakthrough came when a well-known collector walked into my shop with a request that changed everything. He wanted a fully custom-built chopper, something unique, something that blended old-school craftsmanship with modern performance. He handed me a deposit, told me he trusted me to make it perfect, and left with nothing but my word that I would deliver. When I looked down at the check, my hands nearly shook. $40,000. I worked on that bike like my entire future depended on it, because in a way, it did. Every detail, every curve, every piece was designed, fabricated, and assembled by my hands, and by the time I finished, I knew it was the best work I had ever done. When he came to pick it up and saw what I had created, he did not just smile. He stared at it like he had never seen anything like it before. A week later, a motorcycle magazine ran a full-page feature on the build, calling it one of the best custom choppers of the year, and from that moment on, everything changed. The shop went from steady business to non-stop demand overnight. People from all over the state, and eventually from across the country, started reaching out, asking if I could build their dream bikes, restore their vintage Harleys, or bring their forgotten machines back to life. Within 2 years, I had 20 employees, a waiting list that stretched 8 months out, and more work than I ever imagined possible. I expanded the shop, bought better equipment, and hired the best mechanics I could find, but I never let go of the work myself. I still got my hands dirty every day, still personally inspected every custom build, and still made sure that every single bike that left my shop was flawless. With success came the things I had spent years dreaming about, but never thought I would actually be able to afford. I finally bought myself the motorcycle I had wanted since I was a kid, a 1969 Harley-Davidson, fully restored to perfection, a machine that represented everything I had worked for. Not long after that, I bought a house just outside the city, a place with enough land to clear my head, a garage big enough to hold my personal projects, and a quiet that reminded me of how far I had come. Looking back, I realized that every sacrifice, every long night, and every moment of doubt had led me to this. I had built something from nothing, with no help, no shortcuts, and no one to rely on but myself. And for the first time in my life, I did not feel like I had anything to prove to anyone. I had already won. For years, my parents and my brother never reached out, never asked how I was doing, never showed the slightest interest in my life. It did not bother me anymore, because I had long since accepted the fact that to them, I had never been the son worth paying attention to. But after everything I had built, after years of staying away, I decided to make an appearance at Thanksgiving for the first time in nearly a decade. Not because I missed them or felt the need to reconnect, but because I wanted to see, just once, if anything had changed. Walking into my childhood home felt strange, like stepping into a life I had left behind and no longer belonged to. The moment I sat down at the table, I realized nothing was different. My parents immediately launched into their usual routine, showering Alexander with praise, asking about his work, his investments, his future plans, and acting as if he was the only person in the room worth acknowledging. I barely got a hello before they turned the conversation back to his latest achievement, his connections, and how proud they were of everything he had done. I expected nothing less, so I sat back, ate my food, and let them talk. Then, in the middle of a conversation about financial markets, my brother casually dropped a comment that changed the entire tone of the evening. He laughed and said, "Well, he is doing fine too. You know, with his business making $500,000 a year and almost 800,000 followers online." The room fell silent. My father, who had been halfway through a sip of wine, nearly choked. My mother, who had barely looked in my direction all night, suddenly straightened up, her expression shifting from indifference to something I had not seen in years, interest. "Is that true?" she asked, her voice light, almost sweet, as if she had suddenly remembered I existed. I just nodded, taking another bite of my food without giving them more than that. My father set down his glass and looked at me with an expression I could only describe as calculating. My mother, on the other hand, leaned in slightly, a smile forming as she started talking about how I had always been so hardworking, how she always knew I would succeed, how she was so proud of how determined I had been. I had spent my entire life waiting for them to say something like that, but now that the words were finally coming, they felt hollow. I could see it in their eyes, in the sudden shift in their tone, in the way they were now hanging on to my every word when just 10 minutes ago, they could not have cared less. They did not suddenly respect me, they did not suddenly care about my journey, and they did not suddenly realize they had been wrong all these years. They had found a reason to be interested, and I had a sinking feeling that I knew exactly what it was. The conversation turned quickly, moving from forced enthusiasm about my success to questions about how I was managing my money. My father asked about my financial plans, my investments, my business structure, and then, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, he finally got to the real point of the discussion. "You know, your mother and I have been talking," he said, clearing his throat as he carefully chose his words, "and we were wondering when you were planning to start helping the family." I set my fork down slowly, looking at him as I felt the last remnants of whatever illusion I had left about them shatter completely. He continued, explaining that between Alexander's education costs and some unexpected financial setbacks, they had taken on more debt than they were comfortable with. He mentioned how, after everything they had done for us, it was only fair that I contribute now that I was in a position to help. He did not phrase it as a request. It was an expectation. They needed $250,000 to secure their financial stability and ensure they could enjoy their retirement without worry. I leaned back in my chair, letting the words sink in, and then I finally allowed myself to laugh. It was not forced. It was not bitter. It was just genuine amusement at how completely predictable they were. My father frowned, clearly not expecting that reaction, while my mother's smile wavered slightly before she recovered, tilting her head in that familiar way she did whenever she was trying to manipulate a situation. "You always wanted to prove yourself?" she said gently, as if she was still trying to play the role of the caring mother. And you have. We are so proud of you. This is just what families do for each other. I stared at her for a long moment before I finally spoke, my voice calm but firm. Families support each other, right? So where was that support when I needed it? Where was it when I came to you with my business plan and just needed a co-signer, not a cent, just a signature? Where was it when I was working 70-hour weeks just to survive while you refinanced the house to pay for Alexander's perfect student life? Where was it when I was struggling to make something of myself while you treated me like I was nothing? The room was silent. My mother opened her mouth to say something, but for the first time in my life, I did not let her finish. You did not believe in me when I needed you, I continued, and now you only care because you found out I have money. This is not about family. This is about the fact that you see me as a paycheck now. My father shifted uncomfortably, clearly not used to being talked to like that, while my mother tried again, her voice softer, as if she thought she could still guilt me into seeing things their way. That is not fair, Ivan, she said, her tone almost sad. We are your parents. We just assumed you would do the right thing. I picked up my napkin, wiped my hands slowly, and then pushed my chair back as I stood. I already did the right thing, I said, looking between both of them. I built my own life without you. And now, I am making sure it stays that way. I did not wait for them to respond. I simply grabbed my jacket, walked to the door, and left, stepping out into the cold night air with a sense of clarity I had never felt before. They had never wanted a son. They had wanted an investment. And now that they saw me as a profitable one, they thought they could finally cash in. But they would not get a single cent. I had no intention of giving them anything. But I also had no interest in arguing any further. So when they asked me again before I left, I simply told them I would think about it. I could see the relief on my mother's face and the satisfaction in my father's nod, both of them already convinced that they had won, that I would come to my senses and hand them exactly what they wanted. But as I walked out of that house for what I knew would be the last time, I had never been more certain of anything in my life. I owed them nothing. When I returned to my city, I pushed the entire conversation to the back of my mind, focusing on my business and my life, thinking that they would either get the message or let it go. I should have known better. It started subtly at first, with passive-aggressive posts from my mother about how heartbreaking it was when children forget their roots, and how some people become so obsessed with success that they lose sight of what truly matters. I ignored it, not bothering to respond, knowing that anyone who knew me would see through it. But then it escalated. A few days later, I started getting messages from old family friends, from distant relatives, from people I had not spoken to in years, all saying some version of the same thing. They had seen what my parents posted. They were shocked that I could be so cruel, and they could not believe I would abandon my own family when they needed me. Confused, I finally checked their social media pages and felt my blood run cold. My parents had gone beyond just making vague complaints. They had turned my refusal into a full-blown public spectacle. My mother had written long, dramatic posts about how I had become arrogant, how money had changed me, how I had left them to struggle despite everything they had done for me. My father had shared stories about how they had supported me when I was young, how they had always given me what they could, and how now, when they were in desperate need, their own son had turned his back on them. There were even photos, pictures of their house from strategic angles to make it look worse than it was, pictures of them looking exhausted and overworked, captions about how they had given everything for their children only to be left with nothing. But the worst part, the part that made my stomach tighten with rage, was the GoFundMe. They had actually created a fundraiser, claiming that they were in financial ruin because I, their ungrateful and selfish son, had refused to help them in their time of need. They wrote that they were struggling to afford even the basic necessities, that they had sacrificed everything for their children, only to be left behind, abandoned, and forgotten. They set the goal at $250,000, the exact amount they had asked from me, and within days, people had already started donating. I stared at the page, at the dozens of comments from people expressing their sympathy, offering money, calling me heartless, and I felt something inside me snap. They were not just trying to guilt me into helping them anymore. They were trying to publicly humiliate me, to force me into giving them what they wanted by turning me into a villain. I was not going to let them get away with it. I called my lawyer the next morning and showed him everything. The social media posts, the fundraiser, the messages I had received from people who now thought I was some kind of monster. He did not even hesitate before telling me that we had a case for defamation. My parents had not just painted me as a bad son. They had outright lied, misled people for financial gain, and publicly damaged my reputation. We filed the lawsuit within the week. The legal process was not quick, but it was effective. Once they were served with the lawsuit, my parents tried to backpedal, claiming that they had just been emotional, that it was all a misunderstanding, that they never meant for it to go this far. But it was too late. I had the evidence, I had the witnesses, and I had the truth on my side. The case did not even make it to trial before they agreed to settle. They were forced to delete every single post, shut down the fundraiser, and return whatever money had not already been spent. And on top of that, they had to cover all of my legal fees, which, given how aggressively they had dragged the situation out, ended up costing them more than they had ever expected. When it was all over, I felt no satisfaction, no triumph, just a quiet sense of finality. They had tried to manipulate me, to use my success as a way to fix their own mistakes, and when that did not work, they had tried to destroy my name. But now, they had nothing. No money, no public sympathy, and no connection to me whatsoever. I blocked them on everything after that, cutting the last thread that had ever tied me to them. If they ever spoke of me again, it would not matter, because I had already made sure that their words had no power over me anymore. A few weeks after the lawsuit was settled, my phone rang with a number I had not seen in years. My father was calling. I stared at the screen for a long moment, debating whether I should even bother answering, but curiosity got the better of me. I picked up, not saying anything at first, just waiting to hear what he had to say. His voice came through, strained but controlled, like a man who knew he was losing but was still trying to pretend he had the upper hand. "This has gone too far, Ivan," he said, as if he had not been the one to drag my name through the mud in front of hundreds of people. "We are family. We should not be doing this to each other." I closed my eyes, letting the words sit in the silence between us, feeling nothing but the weight of years of disappointment. For a long time, I had wished to hear anything from them that sounded like an acknowledgement of what they had done, but now, after everything, his words felt hollow, like a script he was reading out of desperation. There was no apology, no admission of guilt, just an attempt to make me responsible for fixing what he had broken. I exhaled slowly before finally speaking. "You decided what I was to this family the day you laughed in my face when I told you about my dream," I said, my voice calm, steady, final. "Now you can live with the consequences." I hung up before he could respond. I did not want to hear another excuse, another attempt at twisting the narrative, another justification for years of neglect and betrayal. Whatever he had to say no longer mattered, because there was nothing left between us. Now, I wake up every morning knowing that I built everything I have on my own terms. My first business continues to thrive, and I have already expanded into a second one, taking what I have learned and applying it to an even bigger vision. My life is mine. Every success, every step forward, every achievement, something that no one can take away from me. I own my home. I ride the motorcycle I always dreamed of, and I live with a freedom that I never could have imagined when I was a kid, counting every dollar, trying to prove myself to people who never cared. Not once have I regretted cutting them out of my life. Not once have I looked back and wished things had gone differently. Some people will say that family is everything, that blood is thicker than water, but the truth is, family is not about DNA. It is about who stands by you when you have nothing, who believes in you when no one else does, and who respects the life you build, whether it fits into their expectations or not. What do you think? Do you believe that family should always be given a second chance, no matter what? Or do you think there comes a point where walking away is the only choice? I am curious to hear your thoughts.